Hello and welcome to Beer Ladies Podcast. I am Carolyn, and today we are starting our style series where we're going to be talking about different styles of beers. Today we are talking about sours. We will be talking about the different styles of sours, the history, brewing sours, and what to expect when you are drinking a sour. And today we have our co-hosts. We have Thandi, Sarah, and Lisa. And if you haven't already, please follow our podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. Now we're going to go into what you're drinking. Thandi, what are you drinking today?
Cool. Hey guys, I'm actually thrilled to be on the sour episode because I typically don't really drink a lot of sours, but I do enjoy them. So I actually found two different beers that I'm going to try and guzzle down a little bit. The first one is an Irish one. It's Otterbank Brewing and Blending Muff from County Donegal. Now, I think Otterbank is the side project of the guys from Yellow Belly, one of the guys from Yellow Belly.
Ah.
It is called Stick the Kettle On, which will make more sense when we go on. And it is a Brett-infused pale ale. So I'm actually busy sipping on that right now, and I'm enjoying it immensely. It's lovely. And then just for later, I have got a Lindeman's Eau de Gueuzes, which is just a good old classic sour beer, wild or spontaneously fermented and blended, and the finest that Lindeman's got to offer. So yeah, I've got those. Lisa, what have you got?
So I've gone all the way to Canada for this one. I have a Collective Arts pomegranate and grapefruit sour, and can is slightly banged up. That's actually not the fault of the folks I got it from here in Dublin, but because I dropped it earlier. But interested to try this one. It looks like it's one of these things that's sort of skating between being a Goses with some fruit added or Berliner Weiss. We'll talk more about that later, but definitely very tart, and we have actual sun out today in Dublin as we're recording, so it's a good one for a warm day.
Show us the can there again. It blurred out a bit with the...
Oh, sorry, yes. I will get it right in the perfect place in the camera. And Collective Arts, they're a Canadian brewery. Anyone who hasn't come across them, they always have beautiful can art. So definitely one to look for on the shelves.
Sarah?
I'm living vicariously through you guys because I just have a bit of a headache, so I'm just drinking water, but I love sours. This is one of my favorite styles. I'm raring to go, ready to learn about the history and to talk about it and understand why I like it, because I don't know why, but they're just so delicious.
No, understandable. And I'm drinking a Martin House Brewing sour. It's called True Love. It's raspberry sour ale. I like it more than I thought I would, because I never know if I'll like a sour or not until I try it. So... And it's a beautiful pink color. Well, you can't really see it, but it's a very light pink color. So it's good.
Delicious.
Yeah. Cheers, everyone.
Yeah, cheers.
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 Oh, those look so good.
Lisa, the color of yours is phenomenal. It's like grapefruity pink. It's really
it's definitely a grapefruity pink. It's interesting. I wasn't sure what to expect, if it was going to be really a deep sort of almost purple for the pomegranate, but it's definitely more that sort of grapefruity color. And I'm not always a huge fan of the ones that are super grapefruity, but this is actually a really interesting balance. So worth seeking out.
This Otterbank that I'm drinking, it's not as sour, as funky as what I'd almost expect for a Brett ale, but it's actually, I like the fact that you can still taste the hops. It's not so sour that's all it is on the balance. It's still a really lovely beer to drink. I just maybe expected slightly more funky, barnyardy kind of flavors, but hey, good anyway. I'm happy to have it. Okay. So we're going to talk about the different kinds of sour beers. Or Lisa, do you want to talk about history first?
I'll set it up a little bit. So I think it's important to think about, in a sort of pre-refrigeration, pre-industrial brewing era, really up until we figure out what's going on with yeast, which is, we're talking 19th century. Essentially, all beer is sour to some extent or another. Now, I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole of sort of different blends, although we'll certainly talk about that, I think, a bit when it comes to Belgian beers. But I think we'll mostly focus on what happens kind of post that era, because that's when you start to get from sort of the 18th century onwards different sort of identifiable kinds of sour beers. And so it's actually very interesting. Some places will say, we've been brewing this for thousands of years. And if you look back, maybe not. But especially, I think if we're looking at it again through sort of a modern lens, we have kind of the Belgian arm, where it does tend to be very Brett focused, like you were saying, Thandi. And then we have sort of the German ones, your Berliner Weisses, your Goses, which have that lactobacillus kind of sour. So two very distinct kinds of sour. But again, I think a lot of these differences have really, sort of been, properly documentable from sort of 18th century, 19th century onwards. But then we've had this huge explosion of them in craft beer, really only in the last decade or so, because I wrote an article, and this is, I'm sort of going back and quoting myself now, back in 2011, I had to call Goses and Berliner Weisses the other sour beers, because there were only a handful of them being brewed anywhere, either in Germany or in the States. And again, I think this is one where we can really kind of blame the US for the popularity of different kinds of sours taking off. But before that, it really was kind of those more Brett-focused sour beers that got the attention. So it's interesting that what I would suggest is actually kind of a more challenging, in air quotes, taste with that Brett was kind of the one that kicked off first to a certain extent. And then everyone realized, wow, Goses and Berliner Weisses are super drinkable in the sun. Crush one of those, when it's hot and sunny outside. But I think it's really, really interesting, to maybe sort of start with the sort of more Brett ones that do have that kind of, barnyard, horse blanket, those kind of terms that are much more kind of maybe associated with wine in some ways, or cheeses. It's very kind of, in some ways, very kind of a food-focused way we describe them, even though a lot of them don't pair super well with food. So it's just an interesting thing there. But again, the brewing techniques are also very different. So there's a lot there to talk about. But I think if we can kind of divide them into kind of your sort of Belgian arm and German arm, that's a good way to start. But then, of course, there are many, many other variations. But again, even, a little over 10 years ago, you had maybe 10 or 12 total across that whole sort of sour, again, air quotes, spectrum. So it's blown up. I'll throw in some good quotes later as we go through, but I think it's important to think about how relatively new this is.
Especially now, almost the American wild ales, right?
Yeah.
So they're a lot newer than the European branch sour beers. So Sarah, you were looking into those earlier, and off camera asked us, what is the difference between those, because there's such different styles there.
Yeah, I was reading through about European sour ales, the Berliner Weiss, the Flanders, the things I can't exactly pronounce very well, and then scrolling down in the BJCP guideline book about American style wild ones, and I'm like, well, what's the difference? How did we get from European to American? I'm just a little curious about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's interesting too if we think about kind of open fermentation, again, kind of more of a Belgian approach for the most part. Again, once upon a time, everything more or less would have been open fermentation, either with a cool ship or whatever. So you're just whatever magical yeast is floating around in the air. You got in a lot of those. After a while, some of them would be good, and some of them would be not so good. So you really had to take your time and kind of hope for the best. But I think. From the American perspective, Allagash is one of the first that really started to say, ooh, let's try to do this open fermentation. And Russian River as well. We're like, ooh, we're going to do our Brett stuff, but it's going to be off in another part of the brewery, because obviously you don't want to contaminate the rest of your brewery with Brett. That is bad. But again, to think about that sort of open fermentation, which again, historically, there are places obviously in Belgium that have been doing that forever. Cantillon is a good example, but that sort of becomes a thing where I think people suddenly have enough capital to sort of say, I'm going to build a cool ship and then just kind of see what happens. But a lot of those kind of early experiments on the American side are only kind of beginning to come to fruition in the past couple of years, because a lot of these, like you're saying, take time. And I think there's also influence in the American ones from like the bourbon industry, because you can, barrel age the heck out of a lot of these things, but you have to have a relationship with a distillery and all kinds of stuff. But that whole kind of wood age thing, I think, is really important when we think about at least the American sour beers, because that certainly seems to be more prevalent in sort of, either the quick and dirty way, we're going to chuck some oak chips into this, or we're going to invest in a big barrel program and we're going to adopt a barrel, get the community involved. fascinating, the different ways people approach this.
I think there is also one big difference in my mind, and that is, and I mean, look, I stand to be corrected, but in my mind, the more European varieties, the Belgian and the German styles, those styles are actually specific styles. So if you're judging them in a beer competition, or if you're brewing them, they're quite specific in what they're supposed to taste like. And because certain breweries have been doing them for a long time, they're very consistent, even though they're wild fermented and all of these different things. Whereas now the American styles, you can take any style of beer and sour it. So you could have a sour stout. You could age a stout.
Really?
Yeah, you can. Yeah. And Joanne had one on one of our podcasts, I think, a while back, and she loves it. But so you can take any style of beer, whether it's a pale ale, whether it's an IPA, you get sour IPAs, you get sour wheat ales, all of the different base styles of beer. Now, the way that you treat them or how you add different kinds of yeasts or different bacteria to sour them makes them their own thing. So they're not one style of beer. It's a catch-all for adding something to a base style and seeing what the hell happens and hoping it's good.
Yeah, because what I'm drinking is an ale, like just a sour ale.
Mm-hmm.
So
I feel like
Yeah.
I should have known this, but a sour stout sounds like I don't know if I would like it, but I really want to try it. I'll try
I would
anything.
try it.
Yeah, we'll
I
try
would
it for
definitely
science.
try it. Try for
Yeah.
science for sure. Taste buds. Gotta need to know what that is.
Absolutely. And I think too, like the first couple of, like you're saying, sort of American wild or American sour ones that I came across were just, like you're saying, here's our pale ale that we've thrown some bread in, or here's our IPA that we've, thrown some bread in or tweaked. And it's interesting. And I think it kind of in some ways sort of presages where we are with hazy stuff, where we're like, we threw some other grains in. What happened? So
I have a dumb question. What is Brett? Other than
Okay.
a friend of mine. Every time I hear Brett, I'm like, my friend Brett.
Okay, so let's go into this a little bit. So when sour beers can pretty much be split into two different kinds. Brett or Brettanomyces, Saccharomyces, I think is the full name. It is a kind of yeast. And it's actually a family of yeasts. You even get different strains of them, but collectively just known as Brett. So Brettanomyces is a kind of yeast. It is, so it's a different kind of yeast to the normal yeast that you would ferment beer with. Often it's used in addition to the normal sort of beer yeast, which is Saccharomyces cerevisiae if it's ale, and Saccharomyces pastoriaris, I think, if it's lager. Now I'm butchering those names, but Saccharomyces is beer yeast, and then Brett is wild, crazy fermented weird yeast. It's found on the fruit, on the skins of fruit, so it's found everywhere. As with all like wild yeasts and bacteria, they're all around us all the time. So, but Brett, when you're adding it to a beer, it will add firstly different kinds of flavors. So it might add anything from apple, pineapple, plum. It could add fruity flavors, especially apparently if it's added on its own. So you can brew beers only with Brett, or you can use different strains of Brett, different strains of lactobacillus, different strains of Saccharomyces, and have like a mixed fermentation, which is I think where a lot of these mixed ferments come from, is adding lots of them. So this is a specific kind of yeast, and it gives us effectively a spectrum of flavors. On the sort of lower side, it gives us fruitiness. On the high side, it gives us horse blanket, hay, like weird barnyard funk. And it's like a weird thing to describe, because how on earth do you describe what a barnyard tastes like? But if you can almost smell hay, like wet hay in your mouth, that's what it tastes like.
Yeah, and when they've gone too far, you get that kind of ammonia sort of a scent flavor. Although some people are into that. Again, there's a spectrum, I think, here. But and I think too, again, back in the day, some of these would have been blended, and of course in Belgium still are blended. You get your old and new ones, but that's something we'd have to do a whole deep dive on, just different blends and the history of that. But there's just a lot going on. But yeah, it's absolutely, again, that the yeast is what's driving it. We're going to talk about yeast in a couple of weeks. We're going to have a whole yeast episode, so we can talk about some of that.
So then the other big split of sour ales or sour beers is lactobacillus and pediococcus, which has been re-taxonified to be part of the lactobacillus group, but it's two different bacteria. So not yeasts now, they're bugs. They're basically bugs that you can add to your beer. Now what they add is something like a sharp, clean acidity. So if you almost think of what sourdough is like. Sourdough, kimchi, sauerkraut. All of those are things that use lactobacillus to ferment and give you that sourness. It's not funky. It's not straw, hay. It's kind of clean, but it's not the same as vinegar. So vinegar is a different kind of acid, and that's called acetic acid. And that can happen too, which is one of the ones that you actually want to avoid. So of the different acid-producing bugs, bacteria, and yeasts, you want to keep the acetic acid out, but you want to, depending on what you're going for, you want to keep the lactobacillus or pediococcus in, and you want to keep the Brett in. Again, depending on what you want to do. So you don't have to use both. You can use one, you can use both, you can use multiples. And that's kind of part of the experimentation. My suspicion is still that people started using Brett only as a way to salvage big tanks of beer that had gone off, and they just aged them for like 2 years, and they were like, oh, this is actually pretty sweet. Yay. I promise you, that's my working theory.
Waste not, want not.
I completely agree. I completely
Exactly.
agree. Yep.
I have a question. I'm just reading through the guidelines here about Brett beer, and I'm seeing a lot of the same words you guys are talking about, the barnyard or the the acidic or the nail polish remover kind of taste or whatever. One of the comments on the Brett beer style is these beers should never be a Brett bomb. What's a Brett bomb?
Oh yeah, that's when it's gone too far and it's just so extreme that
It's just Brett.
I feel like a baby diaper is one of the bad, ones you can get to. Yeah, you can really go just in a direction with some. Yeah.
I have a question. So, like, are farmhouse ales considered? I should probably know this, but I haven't had one in a long time. So, like, are farmhouse ales considered sours?
Okay,
yeah, I'm thinking the same thing because the flavors. I'm thinking I like saisons. Maybe this is like the segue into the reason why we like sours.
Interesting question. Lisa, I don't know, maybe you know more than me, but they're not considered sours.
They're not, but that doesn't mean they couldn't be sour as
exactly.
well. So there's not sort of a straight Venn diagram, but yeah, your farmhouse. Again, farmhouse is kind of a catch-all in a lot of ways. Obviously, saison is a farmhouse style. Right. I have seen a sour saison. I think, Thandi, going back to your idea, I don't think that was done on purpose. I think they were just like, we made this, we got to sell it. And again, it was not great. But again, that said, a lot of these things, especially thinking about Berliner Weisses and Goses and things like that have that lactobacillus, there's a good argument that a lot of these had more of a Brett character as well back in the day, and that people kind of got away from that. But again, we don't know it. We don't have sort of 100% evidence, but I would recommend everyone go and read Martin Cornell and Ron Pattinson, who are doing awesome work in this space to try to sort of figure some of that out. But it's a really good question because farmhouse does not equal sour, but it also doesn't necessarily not equal sour. So.
Right. Because I'm pretty sure I've had some sour farmhouse ales, but they also have that farmy smell. So when you said that, I was like, well, where do they fit?
Yeah.
And beer.
This is, can I just say, this is, so Thandi and I'm doing those BGCP tasting classes where like each class you focus on a style and you taste and you're learning and reading the BGCP guidelines. This is my thing. There are so many different categorizations and then subcategories, and I find it so incredibly confusing that there's so much overlap, and I just think that this is, I don't understand how people remember all of this. It's so crazy to me. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm just like, where does this fall?
Well, and I think it's gotten harder. It's gotten harder too, because when I did the BJCP exam initially, this is again probably 12 something years ago now, there weren't as many categories. They've expanded, but you're absolutely right. There's more and more subcategories. It's a brain dump, no matter what. You're just kind of memorizing stuff. But I do think, though, that when you're doing those tasting classes, those are still pretty consistent in terms of trying to determine, is this an off style or an off flavor, or is it an off flavor in this style but fine in another one? And especially when you're talking about sours, something may be completely wrong in, for example, a really clean pale ale, but could be absolutely fine in something else. So
yeah. I think with saisons, they often come out slightly tart, but they're never sour unless they've been deliberately soured again. So that that could be an example of a sour saison as opposed to Saisons were really just, I mean, they're also a catch-all for different ales, typically used as refreshers, like during the day for different farm workers, and they were almost in-house, so that people would almost have their own yeast. It would be spontaneous and wild fermented to begin with, and then they would, harvest that yeast, reuse it over and over again, because when you're making beer at size, yeast is exceptionally expensive. So, you can't, and anyway, in those days, there wasn't just little packets or little vials of yeast to buy for people. So I think they're related, but they're not the same, and they're not on the same spectrum. Probably because of the flavor profiles as well. You wouldn't get so much lactobacillus or that in a saison. Could be wrong. Happy to learn.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't think I've ever come across one. But again, that doesn't mean there aren't some out there. Or again, there's
I bet there are
a particular little region somewhere that's doing something very specific. I mean, it's all about your terroir at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I bet there's like somebody who's figuring out how to apply like a Rule 34 to beer making. Just like whatever you can think of, let's do it. Like,
I bet there is like a beer named Rule 34.
Oh, there has to be. But I bet you it's some sort of like sour milkshake IPA, barrel aged, it's like one of those pastry stout things that you don't even know what they are really. And then they add sourness and milkiness and everything. And you're like,
and then it's like $15 a can.
There's a brewery here that did a cherry pie sour, and I was like, all right, now I'm curious to try it. I tried it. It was amazing. It had a little bit more vanilla in it, but it was still I was like, I feel like I'm drinking a cherry pie, just with like a little bit more vanilla than and it was fantastic. So people are getting creative. I mean, because that sour could have gone really wrong, but they did it really well. So
now I had the opposite of that spectrum, and this is some years ago now. This was at Philly Beer Week, which is a wonderful event. Hopefully they'll get it back this year, fingers crossed. But everyone, like you said, sort of thrown the kitchen sink at what they've got on offer, because everyone wants to try the weird thing or the thing you can't normally get. And I had, and it sticks in my mind because it was so extra, I had an oak-aged Imperial Agave Berliner Weiss. Sam, no.
What?
No.
Sounds like a lot going on.
Yeah,
it was too much.
It was way too much. It was not good. And I had paid, again, for probably a 10-ounce beer. I want to say it was like $10 or $12. And again, I was happy to pay because I like the brewery usually. But I was kind of like, did they mean to do this, or did this just go in a direction and they had to get it out? And again, not going to name the brewery because everything else from them was always lovely. But
I'll just Google the title. Google all the ingredients and be like, ooh.
But that said, I've had a really good agave Berliner Weiss from a different brewery. So again, all very possible. But they didn't try to add the extra sour. They didn't try. It was just too much.
I feel like an agave Berliner Weiss sounds amazing, but when you barrel age it, that's where it's gone wrong.
It was too much, and it was definitely that kind of like we threw some smoked oak chips in the way that like you get like a liquid smoke flavor from some.
No.
No, and again, they're usually a lovely brewery, but it was a no for me.
No, sounds like it.
Gonna be a no for me, dog.
Yeah.
100%.
So then, what kind of sour styles do we have then? Because again,
this is just me Googling because I don't know a lot about sour beers. I just know that I like to drink them. Lambic beers, which I didn't realize were sours, but it makes sense.
You mean lambics?
Yeah, lambic. Sorry.
I like the idea of like lambada, the forbidden drink. Though.
No, lambic is kind of a fun thing.
Lambic beers. I didn't realize those were sours, but I guess I haven't had one in forever. Flanders Red Ale. Ode Bruin.
Yep.
Ode Bruin.
Yeah.
Goses or Goses, however you say it. People.
Yeah, we were having how to pronounce it. Yeah, I didn't realize. Are these two the Gueuse?
Gueuzes.
Yeah, that's the Belgian one.
Yeah, that's Gueuzes. And then Goses
or Goses. Everybody pronounces it differently.
True.
Let's clear up. How do we say this?
Oh gosh, now see, I've asked two different Belgian people, and we should have Charlotte, one of our friends, on to clear this up, because I've heard Gueuse for the one from one Belgian person, but I've also heard Gueuzes from another Belgian, but only Goses for the German. So
Yeah.
Interesting.
So
And
that's how
then
I've heard it. Yeah.
we have Berliner Weiss and American style ale, and I'm sure there is plenty more that are not on this list, but I think these are like the ones you see the most probably.
And back in the day, and I'm saying back in the day, like even 15 years ago, I feel like you only had like your Flanders Red, your
Lambics,
like,
maybe.
those were your Lambics. Those are kind of your OGs of everything
Fruit
there,
Lambics.
and then 100%, and your creeks too. If you start to again blend things up, and then you only started getting the German ones again, sort of 15-ish years ago. Not that they had disappeared, but they were very, very limited. In fact, somewhere there's a photo of me again from this period, like posing with one of my bottles that I'd gotten with the Goses because they were so hard to find, and I'm like, oh, here I am with my little friend.
I've only ever had 2 Goses in my whole tasting life. Like you don't see them very often.
They've exploded in the US though. They are everywhere now, and it were for the past couple of years, but for a long time, so hard to find. But so
in the US,
I want to find this German sour. I want to find this German sour now. I'm determined to find it.
A couple of years ago, several of us went from the Ladies Craft Beer Society of Ireland. We went to Brussels and we visited Cantillon, and then we just kind of went around Brussels and drank a lot of Cantillon and all the ones that I can't pronounce. Goses. Oh gosh. Those people know what I'm talking about. But it was like, if I can recommend anything, go to Belgium, drink the beer.
Absolutely.
It is so good.
Absolutely. And it's a funny thing too, the extent to which, again, you used to be able to get those imported, certainly here to Ireland, to the UK, to the US. That's how you would get those. There wasn't really like a local production of those styles until suddenly there was. And then again, they just sort of explode. But I think it's really interesting to go then back to specifically the German ones like Berliner Weiss and Gose. I think Berliner Weiss was kind of the first in terms of making kind of a headway, sort of first in the US and then other places. But the one I always used to go for was the Ich bin ein Berliner, which was made by Notting Head in Philadelphia. And I lived in Philadelphia at the time. And it was just so good because it was, a very low key, 2.8%, 3-ish% beer. You would add the Woodruff, your sort of green syrup to your taste because they were very, very sour. And I think that's been kind of the thing that's made them become more popular is now they come sort of pre-canned with a flavor, or pre-bottled, either one, but they will have like, their own raspberry or their own something. You don't normally see the Woodruff, the green, the kind of traditional thing you would have, but that was the best beer if you'd been running. Like I did the Broad Street run, which is a 10-mile race, and then went right to the pub, had that at 10 o'clock in the morning after you've done a long run, like perfect like recovery beer because you're not going to get hammered.
Sounds amazing.
If they had just advertised running, like, okay, you're running to
you get beer at the end
the pub, I probably would run a little more often. You could have just told me, run to the pub. There you get your exercise and then you get a pint. I would run.
Absolutely. But then again, they started sort of pre-canning them with different flavors, different places. Unfortunately, Notting Head closed. They're no longer with us. The beer itself still pops up here and there, other places. But then Goses suddenly took off in the States, I think, because you got that sort of salty flavor too. That, again, it's so refreshing. Again, Dogfish Head makes one, Sea Quench, which they do advertise as a sort of post-run recovery drink. Because again, it's like 3.5-4%. It's just gorgeous to drink it on a hot day. And that kind of, that style is just so nice. Again, there's that tartness is what just makes it refreshing and very, very moist. But it's a very soft kind of thing too. I think, again, to go back to the Brett, they don't tend to have that kind of soft character necessarily, but the German ones do. So.
I think, and if I were to think about why I like sours, I like tart things, I like sour things, although I don't like cherries. Like, and you were talking about the cherry pie one, it's just cherries not for me. It's my least favorite flavor. But like the reason I like sours is, a day like today in Dublin and it's sunny and there's not a cloud in the sky, sitting out in a beer garden and having like a nice, like, I don't want to say light, but it's refreshing. It's an uplifting, refreshing taste. Like, I don't want to have a stout in the middle of summer. And, I think that's why I like them, because I don't really like ciders generally. They're too sugary, but the sour beers are are like that ticks the box on a day like today, where I'm at the beach right now. My background.
Yeah, Carolyn, you must have a bunch in Texas. I feel like when I was last there, and this is years ago, there were beginning to be a lot of sort of, again, especially Goses, I want to say, just again, there's a lot of that sort of German influence there.
Yeah, there's a lot of sours too. I mean, you don't really find a lot of Berliner Weiss, which I kind of wish we did, but it's mostly like sours, pale ales, pub ales. Actually, there's very few pub ales. I take that back. A lot of IPAs, which if you've listened to this podcast before, you know I'm sick of IPAs. A lot of IPAs. Oh, I don't know. I just feel like everybody goes to an IPA. I'm like, but there's so many other beers.
Yeah.
There's so many other options.
Well, especially if it's hot, it's nice to have a couple of choices, especially, and I think this is something that gets left out. A lot of sour beers, not all, but they are often more low alcohol, so you could be, a little more sessionable, and I think that makes
like a Berliner.
This one's 5.2, so
that's a mid strength, but like a Berliner Weiss is typically quite low in alcohol. It's not a highly it's not high in alcohol, and it doesn't have a lot of hops. So it's almost the opposite end of an IPA, but not the malty side, more the sour side.
Now I'm gonna be on the hunt for Bruin. How do you say it?
Oud Bruin.
So if anybody knows where I can find it, let me know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about sour beers, and obviously I talked about like why I like them and everything, but I was thinking about my mom, and I told her before, I was like, Mom, I'm going to mention you on today's podcast. And she was like, oh wow, yeah, I agree with that. But she doesn't like beer. She doesn't drink. But I would get a couple beers at the grocery store, at the end of the aisle, Carolyn, where it's like, or and Lisa, like at the end of the grocery aisle, they'll have like a make your own 6-pack. And that's kind of where I started like experimenting and trying different beers, because you don't want to commit to a whole thing. And I would pour one at home and watch a movie with her and be like, do you want to try this, Mom? And she would sip it, and it was always like with sours, she's like, that's beer? And like, because her idea of beer is like a Budweiser or Coors Light that guys would have out of the cooler at a softball game or something. And then I think the sour beers are kind of like, if I know somebody who doesn't like beer, it's kind of like the gateway drug, because it's like, and then they realize beer can be so different than what you think it can be. And sours are quite like, I think they're a good one to introduce people to if they don't know anything or not what to taste. So.
Some people just don't. I ask people, I'm like, do you like sour stuff? Because if you don't like sour stuff, you're probably not going to like a sour beer. Some people just don't. I'm like, but I tell people, I'm like, try it because you might like it, but you might not.
But it's different. It's not what you think.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So should we get on to a basics of how to brew a sour beer?
Yeah, because I think it'd be good just to give a sense of, we're not just throwing the stuff in, although you can do that too.
Yes.
Yeah, set mashing, all that good stuff.
So let's just very quickly recap on the basic brewing process. Okay, so the first step is mashing, where you're putting the grains into water and you're effectively making a tea with the grains. You're getting all the sugars out of the water so that you can get all those sugars out for the fermentation to happen. Then you're basically draining it and you're adding a little bit more water so that you're getting all of the rest of them out, and then you boil it, and then you ferment it, as in you cool it down very quickly, you add the yeast, it goes into primary fermentation, and then depending on what you're doing, you either keg it and force carbonate it, or you can age it, or you can bottle it. There's many ways to go from there. So I just wanted to very quickly recap that, because when you're brewing a sour, there are effectively 3 ways plus a halfway to change your beer from a normal fermentation to a sour beer. So the first one is when you're using Brett specifically, but it doesn't have to only be Brett, but definitely when you're using Brett. So it's basically like any other fermentation, except that once you've done your primary fermentation, so all of the normal yeast has cleared out and made your alcohol, it goes into like a conditioning barrel that has been inoculated or laced with some sort of Brett. Okay, so what that does is that it then sits on that barrel, and the Brett gets into the beer and it adds all of those characters, but it takes a long time. Like you can't even touch that beer for at least 6 months. So it's a very long process. But Brett is a slow sort of yeast, so it takes a long time, but it does a really good job of beers that are even high ABV, high IBU, which is hoppiness or bitterness. So it can handle lots of kinds of beers. It just takes a long time. So that's the one way that you'll do it. The other way is by sour mashing or by kettle souring. So in the mash now, the first step, you could sour there. So what you could do is you could get all of your sugars out, like you're getting up to 67 degrees or 76 or whatever you want to do. Then you let it sit. You cool it down to about 43 to 49 degrees. You let it sit for about 2 days without any oxygen, and you add something in. So normally a lactobacillus now at this stage, because lactobacillus being a bacteria, not a yeast, you don't want it to ferment. You just want it to add something to make it more acidic, more sour. So you could mash it, cool it, pitch your bugs, and then you're holding it there for a few days. And then you're going to carry on as normal. So then you're going to sparge, boil, ferment, bottle or keg as usual. But what will have happened is that the pH of your I suppose of your wort will have gone way down, and the flavor would have been changed by the bugs that you pitched. So it's kind of the same as any other brew day, except that it takes a few days longer, and you stuck at one step, just trying to make it more acidic and more tart. Then there is kettle souring. So instead of doing it in the mash, you're doing it at the boil stage. So after you've mashed and lautered and now you've boiled, you cool it down. So this is your final volume of wort. You cool it down, you pitch your bugs, and then you come back again, and then you can reboil. Like, oh, you don't actually boil. You do it before boiling. Sorry. You add your bugs before boiling. You then hold it for a few days again, trying to remove as much oxygen as you can, because the more oxygen that gets in, the more likely you will get the bad bugs, the ones that taste like vinegar. So there are a couple of things that need to happen. So we don't want to have acetobacteria in there. So you keep it anaerobic, so no oxygen, and then you proceed as normal. So again, it's like, it's not that big of a deal, even for a home brewer, to be able to, especially kettle sour. I know a lot of people that have kettle soured at home with great success, and they've made Berliner Weisses, they've made lots of different styles of beer. I don't know that many home brewers who have played with Brett unless they've gotten their hands on barrels, because as Lisa mentioned earlier, typically when you're brewing, you're trying to keep these bugs out. You're trying to keep these yeasts out because they're adding characters that you're not wanting in your beer. But when you're doing sour beer or a wild fermentation, which they'll often have the same result, but there's slightly different processes involved. You're inviting them in, but you're kind of only inviting selected guests. You're not inviting everybody in. So those are the three main ways. Okay, so aging in a barrel with Brett, doing a sour mash, which apparently is quite tricky, but it is doable, and then kettle souring, which is very doable. It's just that you've got to keep control of your oxygen. Then there's the third, the third and a half, the sort of halfway, which is somewhat called cheating by some. It is where you finish your beer and you just spike it with lactic acid. So you're just spiking it to make it as acidic or as tart or as sour as you like, and that's it. My suspicion is that a lot of commercial breweries are doing that because it's much, much quicker. You don't have as many things to control. It's probably a lot more consistent, and it gets you the results that you want without even potentially infecting anything else. So my suspicion is that a lot of the commercial beers that we get are those, unless you're doing one of these guys, or for those listening, that was my Gueuzes that I'm drinking. So unless you're doing one of those, or unless you're drinking a beer from a brewery that is quite committed to wild or mixed fermentation or something like that. So something like Wide Street we spoke about last week.
Yeah.
We do a lot of mixed fermentation.
Yeah, and in fact, if
I had one of theirs. I think. I was saying, Christina drank one on the last. I think it was the Branding and Sexism episode. She had one that I had previously as well. The mixed fermentation. I can't remember the name.
The lager, I think.
The lager.
So good. I love what they do.
Yeah, and in fact, if you want to hear a little bit about how, Thandi, exactly what you're saying, there are these different sort of directions you can go, but sometimes you can land in the same result. On the A New Brew podcast, which again, Christina was on not long ago, in the episode that Lineman is on, they talk about how they had made this amazing sour thing with very bready, but their mobile canning people quite reasonably were like, nope, for exactly the sort of sanitation reasons we're talking about, infection, they did not want to touch it.
Yeah.
So they had to go back and remake the same beer in air quotes, but as a kettle sour instead of,
Exactly.
going to this other. So again, you're kind of getting to the same result, but in a different way. And again, having to sort of tweak, your ABV and things like that. But it's interesting, again, that there are a lot of ways to get to the same thing, and you may have to figure out what's most efficient for your particular use case. So.
Now, I've never brewed a sour beer, and I'm probably not likely to unless I get a much bigger property where I can keep things very far away from each other. But what I did find interesting was that, like, lactobacillus you'll use for things like a Berliner Weiss, where you have almost no hops. So you're really looking for a beer that is like low IBU, so low bitterness, because it cannot handle beers with a higher alpha acids from the hops. So you're really looking at low IBU beers, so like a Berliner Weiss. You could use Pediococcus for ones that are higher IBUs, but you'd never use it alone, apparently. So you'd always mix it with a lactobacillus or with a Brett. So you can layer these things. You can use them alone. Like Brett is often used alone, or it can be used in conjunction with everything else. And yes, and you'll use them depending on what you're looking for. You might use one or more in combination, and maybe at different stages of your ferment or of your mash process. So I thought that was really interesting, because I didn't really know the difference. I knew that there were different bugs and yeasts that you could use, and lactobacillus. I really I feel like I'm fairly familiar with lactobacillus because I do a lot of fermenting stuff at home.
Yeah.
But I've never done it with beer.
In yogurt, yeah, exactly.
Yes, exactly. It's in your yogurt. It's probiotic. And Sarah, I've got a slight theory as to why I think sours are so good, and I think it's because we somehow know that those ordinarily those probiotic-rich foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, sourdough bread, or whatever, are really good for our guts. So I wonder if it's a little bit of a response where that kind of sourness evolutionary tastes and feels good to us.
I bet that's an interesting theory.
Yeah.
Boy, if you tell me drink a sour a day to keep the doctor away, I am all on board.
This is making me want to go brew a Kentucky Common again, which again is one of those historical styles that we know some stuff about, but the details are so hazy. You can kind of fill in the blanks. You could say, oh, maybe they had a lot of lactobacillus. Maybe it did have Brett. We don't really know. We do know that they tend to have that step mashing technique, but not always, because it's all over the place. Although the one I had once that was commercially produced, and again, we're all guessing at this stuff. Like, no one knows for sure. Like, it was very akin to kind of a very, again, a very sort of like tart, refreshing, effectively Berliner Weiss, but without any kind of syrup or additional flavor. So again, there's huge variety out there.
Mm.
But I like your idea, Thandi. Sours are good for you. I think, if Guinness can be good for you,
why not?
Why not all these others?
Brew more sours, please. Do it.
Yeah.
Love them.
Yeah.
I'll drink them all.
I was pleasantly surprised. Well, I was half and half surprised that in my local off license there were a few interesting sours. Like I've got a Flanders Red in my fridge, and I got these other two, so the Brett Pale Ale and the Gueuzes. But there was only one other sour, two. There were two other sours there, and I wasn't interested in those because I know that they're just, I don't want to say faked, but they're one of those kind of quick process sours. And for me, they don't really hold that much interest. I prefer the Brett, where there's a little bit of complexity in the character of them. I prefer those myself. Although I do, I just prefer those. Give me all the straw. All the horse blanket. I want it.
Yeah. No, I have to think. I can tell you which ones I don't like.
No, and I think that's okay too. Yeah.
Like the fruity, is it the fruity? The ones that are syrupy, I'm not a big fan of those. And again, I'm not a huge fan of the cherry flavor. So I think sometimes like those, is it the Lindemans ones?
The Creeks.
Not my favorite. They're just not. But I like the more refreshing tart ones, like that grapefruit one that you're drinking right now, Lisa. It looks perfect. Chef's kiss.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm kind of strange. I don't tend to love the more bready kind of horse blankety ones. They're not are not my jam. I once had to judge a whole bunch of them for a homebrew competition. I'd be like, "This is good, but I don't like it." And it was one of those things where you had to kind of step back and say, "I can see this is well made." But no, I'm much more sort of Team Berliner Weiss, Team Gose. We don't have as many Goses here as you get in the States now. So hopefully, Irish Brewery summer, it's coming. We can make a couple of Goses. So,
Carolyn, what kind of sours do you like?
All of them except for like the barmy tasting ones. But yeah, I mean, but then there's some that I haven't tried. So, to be announced. I may or may not like them, but I mostly like the clean, sour ones. I mostly tend towards the fruit ones, but sometimes I don't like the fruit ones. Like there was an apricot one that the bartender was like, "This is amazing," and I was like, "This is terrible." So, I was like, "I don't like it." I'm like, I'm glad you like it, but I don't. I was like, "Don't bring this to me ever again."
Exactly.
But yeah, I tend to go for the fruitier sours. So that's my.
Oh, good.
Nice.
How about you, Thandi?
You know what? I like all of the funky ones, the barnyardy ones, because I'm also a big saison fan, and I know that they're not the same thing, but like, give me all of that weird funk and that weird complexity, and I'm there for it. But that being said, like, I'm really enjoying this Gueuse, and I like it when sour beers taste like very champagne-y and are quite dry. Like, I really enjoy that. I do enjoy
I'm
that.
with you, Thandi. I'm with you 100% on that one.
I think they're lovely. And you know what? I'm open-minded. I want to taste other styles that have been soured. So I've never tried a stout that's been soured. I've never even tried an oat brain. So so I don't even know what that tastes like actually. But I'd be keen.
Yeah.
At least for science, gotta taste.
Yeah,
I know.
We can go again. Yeah.
I know, that's the thing. It's like what I miss about traveling the most is going into a bar, a craft beer bar, or any pub and trying something like, I've never seen this, never heard of it, don't know. Let me taste, and then
trip to Belgium, trip to Berlin, trip to Leipzig. We need to. Yeah,
we're doing it. It's happening.
Can we do it all in 1 week so that way, like, I can just take a week off work?
Yes, because there are trains. We can do it all. It could work. Yeah.
If I fall asleep in the bar, you guys are just gonna have to make sure you wake me up when we go to the next one.
There you have it, folks. Someday we're going to be able to travel again and try some of these things in the wild, as it were. I did a thing.
Well done.
Oh dear.
Bad pun alert.
Absolutely. I'll be in my cool ship. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're at the end of our episode. Thank you for listening and spending time with us today. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can, again, check out our podcast on anywhere that you can get podcasts and YouTube. Have a great day.
It was wonderful to chat, ladies.
Absolutely. Oh, this was fun.
See you later. Do it. It'll help with it.